Okay, well, I'm delighted to introduce Kirsty Hughes, Dr. Kirsty Hughes, who is an expert on EU relations with Scotland. And I am going to ask some questions relating to an association agreement. So obviously my first question is, what is an association agreement?
Okay, thank you. It's lovely to be able to do this video, and I'm sorry not to be with you in person. An association agreement, you can sort of think of it as a trade agreement plus, because it's like a deep trade agreement, you could say. Ukraine has one, and it's called if I get it right, deep and comprehensive free trade area, and then the Western Balkans, for instance, have each country of the candidates there have stabilization and association agreements. But also countries who aren't candidates to join the EU can have those agreements with Brussels, because it creates a stronger framework, not only for trade, but also for social, cultural, and political issues. From the EU's point of view, if you are a candidate country, and so you're embarking on or in the middle of the accession process, it's a place where the steps in the accession process can feed into relations between the two, the EU and the candidate country.
Okay. Are they all the same? Obviously, there are different countries. Do they cover the same topics in each one, the same issues?
They're very similar, but they're not identical. So certainly it depends, as I said, on whether a country is a candidate country or not. But it also depends on particular issues around the individual country. It might be something as simple as does the country have a coast? Does it have a fishing industry or not? Or it might be other more tricky technical issues about particular sectors of the economy. So on the one hand, the EU is very used to negotiating these deals. There is, to some extent, if it's not a template, it's kind of like an outline template. But equally, just as you wouldn't impose identical trade agreements on any straightforward free trade agreement with another country, nor would you do so with an association agreement. So they do have to be negotiated. And I guess one question for an independent Scotland doing that is how long it would take.
Yeah, exactly. So considering often an association agreement is a first step to becoming an accession country or to actually rejoining the EU, why are they hardly ever mentioned in the media or even by our politicians?
I think it's quite curious in the Scottish case, given that the aim of the SNP and the aim of the Scottish government is independence in the EU, that they don't talk about association agreements more. I think it's maybe part of a bigger issue around the way independence is argued for, where people like to talk about the final state, when we're independent and when we're doing as well as Denmark or when we're in the EU. But of course, it's obvious to everybody the transition is really important, and whether that transition is the one you're focusing on in terms of how you get from independence to being a candidate with an association agreement to joining the EU, or whether it's the economic transition, or whether it's some other political, legal transition. Transition, in a sense, is at the heart of the independence debate, because it's fine to say we'll be this sort of independent country 10 or 20 years hence, but people want to know about their immediate future.
Okay. So do all countries that are currently involved in the enlargement process have an association agreement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they all do. And actually, to be honest, I didn't know this, but I was Googling around this, knowing I was talking to you. And I knew that in the 1990s, all the Central and East European candidates after the Berlin Wall came down, they all had an association.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
Greece, that I did know, but Greece apparently had one of the earliest back in something like 1961, long before it became a candidate to join, and it didn't join for another 25 years.
So does it have to be in place before Scotland, if it was independent, became a candidate country?
No, I don't think it has to be in place before that, but I think it can be in place
Okay.
before that. And I think if you look at the likely timings, so there's maybe other aspects to this that would be good to touch on. But if you look, if on day one the Scottish government has decided, day one of independence, to put its application in on day one, that it's got that ready during the separation talks with the rest of the UK. That, in my analysis, that could take up to a year, because first of all, the Commission will prepare an opinion on Scotland's readiness to be a candidate country. Then it will put a proposal forward to the European Council, which is, as you know, the EU's leaders. And then you have to see if the EU leaders agree, which I think they would do. If we're thinking some point in the next 10 years, obviously it's not going to be that long since we left the European Union. And then eventually Scotland is recognised as a candidate. There are then discussions. Then you have to get one step beyond that to agree to open accession negotiations. You get a negotiating framework. You start talking about some of the pre-accession funding that may be available, as well as all the sort of harder work on making sure you've got all the laws and all the institutions you need. You know, it's a very hard work process, the negotiation. It's not in many ways a negotiation. It's more like an ongoing test. You know, have you done this? Are you ready for this? Are you good enough on that? So not great fun at one level, except you know what you're doing it for. So in parallel to that, basically, there will be discussions on an association agreement. And I think there's a very open question for me as to how long that might take to negotiate, even though, as I say, there are sort of outline templates in the fact that there are others existing for all the current candidates. Scotland would still need its own. So maybe it could be done in 3 or 6 months, or maybe it would take 12 months. So then there's potentially a gap. And there's a pre-association agreement question about what you do in that gap when you've left the UK, but you don't yet have your association agreement. Now,
Okay.
can I just add to that? Because I think it's a critical question. So normally, and we saw this, if you remember, with Brexit, the EU agreed a withdrawal agreement from the EU with the UK government, but before it left the EU, but it wouldn't agree the trade and cooperation agreement we now have until it became a third country. And you would expect it to do the same with Scotland, but there's a big but, and a but that I think is maybe in Scotland's interests, which is if Scotland's leaving the UK, then the UK in that EU-UK trade agreement, trade and cooperation agreement that regulates relations today, trade and other relations, would no longer apply to the right geographical mass, and it wouldn't apply to the right sea and ocean, fishing waters and so on either. So I think there will be two options. Either the EU will have to actually talk to Scotland before it becomes a state, or the simple way around that, as in Brexit, would be to have a transition period where you extend the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement until you've negotiated the association agreement. That would need the UK's agreement too, but something's going to have to be done, and the UK is going to have to do something. It cannot opt to do nothing.
Okay. So if Scotland's not independent by the mid-2030s, do we risk being left behind?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, because what we're seeing at the moment in the EU, and it's very encouraging, and there's so many difficult challenges out there, it's a good thing to see. We're seeing much more renewed enlargement momentum. This is very much driven by Russia's war on Ukraine, and it's really pushed the EU to recognize its core values, that it was established out of the Second World War. It was established as a peace project. And so at the December summit, the EU leaders agreed to open talks, probably in March, with Ukraine and Moldova. They made Georgia a candidate country. The Western Balkan countries who've been candidates for a long, long time and not getting anywhere for a whole mixture of reasons. They're trying to speed that process up. And you can see it taking off in some of the discussions across the EU in think tanks, in media, where people are saying, well, how much does the EU have to change to be able to cope with up to 9 new members? Do we have to have majority voting on foreign policy or on budget issues? How can we make sure, as we see with Hungary being difficult at the moment, that no one country just vetoes everything? So I don't think Scotland exactly risks being left behind. But it's, if the EU was to manage to maintain that political energy, if there isn't, a too terrible outcome of the war in Ukraine, if there's this big bang enlargement by 2035 and Scotland's not there, it's going to feel perhaps even more on the margins. I did see somebody on X, we're now meant to call it, a few weeks ago, I think an academic, and I think it was he was saying, this is going to be the EU's last enlargement. And I replied and said, but what if an independent Scotland wants to join, or Norway wants to join and not be in the European Economic Area anymore? And they replied and they said, oh, yes, well, that would just be an extra bit of sweeping up almost. So, there's not going to not be any more enlargement, but it's a very dynamic moment. And it would be great to see Scotland part of that.
Okay. So what benefits could Scotland, once it's independent, get from an association agreement? For example, would there be access to the single market or funding for projects and stuff like that?
It will depend on obviously on the details of the particular association agreement, but I think the way to think of an association agreement is as its very first step. It's a free trade agreement. So that's at heart what the current UK-EU trade deal is. It's not, as you know, it's not a strong or a good deal because the Tory government wouldn't choose to be in the single market, but it takes away tariff barriers. But it keeps a lot of regulatory barriers in the way. So in its first instance, it would be a free trade agreement, which would be great. It's a first step. But it might, and very likely would, include a whole range of types of cooperation it could be on educational issues, some sort of political issues, climate issues, and it would also look at the extent to which Scotland was aligned with EU regulations, from health and phytosanitary, plant and food and animal health to manufacturing regulations. And the more those rules were aligned, then the more the regulatory barriers would start to come down.
Okay.
And what we also see, there was the problem with the UK trade agreement, is that there's no agreement around key customs procedures, and obviously we're not in the customs union anymore, and so something technical called rules of origin create a problem. So you can't just import something from China to Britain and then import it on tariff-free to the EU. So the association agreement could also help with Scotland and the EU not having too many blocks from the rules of origin problem that the UK currently has. Now, not all these things would necessarily happen at once. Some of them might be phased in over time, especially where Scotland won't be aligned with all the rules and all the regulations.
So what could Scotland offer in return?
Well, it's a two-way deal. So obviously free trade goes in both directions, lack of customs checks or some agreement on this thing called rules of origin or agreements around climate are two-way. Just like the negotiations to join the EU, this is not an even negotiation. The EU is much bigger. It has a lot of power. It's its rules and laws that Scotland would be trying to align with. But obviously Scotland is a market for EU imports. It will offer a good base for EU companies if they want to invest in Scotland, and also for non-EU companies if they can invest in Scotland and also benefit from this association agreement. Then there's an open question, which I can't answer, but there's a question around free movement issues, or if you're not jumping straight to free movement, but what would you do as an independent country? What sort of migration deal would you have with the EU, and could that be put into the association agreement? And so could you start to gain some benefits from that compared to today, again, before you actually became an EU member state?
Okay, so it seems that like having an association agreement is a kind of first step towards rejoining the EU. A lot of people are talking about EFTA, EEA, and they're saying, oh no, that should be a first step. What do you think about that?
I've always said that's misleading. If you want to be a candidate to join the EU, and if you apply, as we were saying, or as I was saying, you know, if you apply as you could on day one of independence, then you follow the path that the EU says its candidates should follow. And the EU expects its candidates to have a trade agreement with it called an association agreement, because it's, as we've discussed, it's a much broader thing than just trade. So the European Economic Area is an alternative to being in the EU. It's not a transition path. You know, we were talking about transition. And I think the other thing to be very clear about, because some people aren't, is that if you join EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, in order to join the European Economic Area, as that's the only route if you're not an EU member state, you cannot also join the EU's customs union. Because if you're in EFTA, you have to try and join the bilateral trade agreements that EFTA already has with a number of countries. That's a condition of joining. And so what I was talking about earlier, although it sounds complex, things like these rules of origin, in other words, this thing to stop China bringing exports into the UK and then getting around the tariffs it faces into the EU by routing them through the UK, which you get round if you have a customs union. You can't do that if you're in the EEA. Obviously, you're not at the table. You don't have, therefore, you're not in all the meetings. So you have a tiny voice, but you don't have the voice you'd have as a member state. You don't have a vote. And what we see since the EEA was founded in 1995, apart from the 4 founding members then, no other state has tried to join it. They've all wanted, despite the barriers, to join the EU. So if you look at the Western Balkans, you know, these are countries that obviously were mired in war and conflict in the 1990s and have faced a lot of economic and political problems all the way through to today, but not one of them has said, oh, we're going to go and join Norway in the EEA. So, you know, you really have to ask, why not? And we also know that back then, Norway wanted to join the EU, but a referendum of its public said they didn't want to. So if a majority of the Scottish wanted to join the EEA and didn't want to join the EU, that would be obviously a completely different political and democratic situation. But today it's clear we have quite a big majority in Scotland for joining the EU. And so it doesn't figure politically for the moment, and it's not a transition route to the EU.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Kirsty. That's brilliant.
It's been lovely to contribute. I hope you have a good day.